Good afternoon and most welcome to 1060 of the Heidegger series. It's a very beautiful day today. Sunny, although it's a bit windy, and I will try out this microphone and see if that can cut out some of the sound deviations. I will today talk about two different books and sort of cross-hatched. I begin to understand the all wisdom words from Edward de Bono. In order to understand something, it always has to be put in. He called it, what did he call it? What's the term? Aggression it wasn't, it was provocation. The thought cannot be furthered without provocation, and he called that special instrument for Poe. It's the act of provocation that creates something new, and understanding is always new. So understanding and creativity come hand in hand. This is not the usual view, but it is the view of great philosophers like Martin Heidegger and Jacques Derrida. Today I will do one of those cross-hatching to avoid metaphysics of presence, or as Heidegger would call it, Seinverlassenheit, the leaving of Sein, the being. I'm going to do it with two different authors. The first one is Nick Huggett, Laws for Nowhere, and it's spelled Nowhere. So already that is very interesting. And he looks at space and time, and how geometry or space and time come into being. That is the difference in quantum mechanics. Space and time are not Seiendes or beings. They are not already out there, but they come to be in the cross-hatching between Thea and Aletheia. And this is so close to Nick Huggett and his Laws for Nowhere. So that is one book. And the second one is Richard Capobianco, and especially his book Heidegger's Being, The Shimmering Unfolding. Richard Capobianco is an excellent, I wouldn't say interpreter of Heidegger, I would say he's something more. Someone who really got to terms with it. Not trying to translate the terms, but really getting into the juicy, real details of Martin Heidegger. He is extremely sharp, a very uncommon feature today in academia, but he is definitely maybe the sharpest knife in the box. I've been hoping for a long time to find someone like Rudolf Garcia also within Heidegger, and the ones I met upon usually do the opposite that Heidegger tried to convey. They seem to forget even more, making his neologisms into concepts, and thereby reinforcing rather than doing destruction. So this is going to be quite interesting. Well, I start with Nick Huggett, and you will understand why I brought him in here, because it's this interesting parallel with physics that makes Heidegger oscillate even more. This is what makes him real. You need to be in coherence, or at least parallel, with quantum mechanics. I think that's an absolute demand. If you try to construct something or interpret something according to Newton, you're bound to be dead wrong. Although, as you will see, Newton of course is useful in a limited context, when it's not too much. Very useful. In quantum mechanics, now I begin, there is neither time nor space. They are not part of the Wheeler-de Wit equation. This is something you don't regard at all as things by themselves, so to speak. They are not pre-constructs out there somewhere and in where something happens. Instead, which this concept, or maybe it's just a construct for the moment, geometry genesis. It means that geometry, including time, comes into birth, and that is very similar to the Big Bang. This is the serious take on these things, and I would say this is closer to what actually happens in experience. So it is already there, phenomenological to a great extent. We are no longer assuming something and force reality to accept it. The conquering of reality, or wanting reality to obey us, our wishes, our confused wishes, as I will get into. And this take from Nick Huggett is very far from the almost scary, deadened, sterile world of the old Cartesian coordinates, the space already placed there, where human beings have no place, nothing of depth, intellect, understanding can enter. We know as a whole the system that we have now of understanding is not sufficient. Although it is more than sufficient, or quite sufficient, for the construction of machinery and many things within science. But it's very, very far from sufficient for us ordinary beings, especially when we are not constructing something, planning something technical, making a drawing, or something similar. But today, and this is the unison voice of both Heidegger and Nick Huggett, that has come to be the model for constructing all knowledge, bar none. And I would say that is a powerful reinforcement of what was previously. What was previously was already a sort of a stalemate, sterile way, sterile take on the world. But that got definitely much stronger with this deadened system. If we think space and time is out there already before we get to it, that will be a disjunct in time, and it will be a dislocalized move in space. We will be twofold wrong already at the very start. And that is making the child stillborn, because room, or the things, and time comes out into being at the same time as we presence. At the same time as Sein is revealed for us, time and space comes into being together, not separated and not before. This sterile world is a sterility in body and mind as well. It's a mechanical attitude, and it takes down that force of the intellect that is so badly needed today, and shows us the way when it's working and when it's not working. If we have false assumptions about the world, listen carefully. We know today that the assumptions that the world is a pre-construct or in 3 dimensions with a sort of point-like way of having objects placed, and those are placed in front of an unknown observer. We know that to be wrong. This is what was proven in quantum mechanics. And of course, if we're wrong with such fundamental things, we will be bound to be wrong in our thinkings, in our doings, in our life goals, in our predictions, because, as I mentioned many times before, if you're not localized in space and see space as limited, that there is a limitation when it comes to space, it will not grow, it will not expand, it will not do its job, it will be a standstill. There's nothing of liveliness coming about if it's already sort of, the grid is put in place, you arbitrarily decided what thinking is going to be long before it's even got the chance of growing. This is why I say it's a stillborn child. Space and time are stillborn in the modern take. We will in the end be sickened and tired, because none of our thinking will be correct. The predictive power of our choices will be at the very lowest. It will be worse than chance, and that is one of the reasons that we let everything to chance, because at least then we have 50% of succeeding. At least if there is a 2-choice model in front of us. And all this modern time with this dislocalization, fragmentization, non-directedness, and I would say tiredness. The world is become blasé. We are bored in our times. We don't get knowledge. We be living out a fantasy rather than the real world, because grasping beforehand in a forehanded way will block out the real world. We know that already, and this is so strong today so that even influences the ones who want to raise the banner and say something went wrong here or something needs to be looked into. And this is something that even Heidegger mentioned in the 60s, and he continually did that he got misinterpreted. And Zionists, they did become something that was in front of a subject, predicated by their thinginess, not by their liveliness, their informative standard. This is the great subjectification of the modern world, or as often is called today, the meaning crisis, the lack of meaning in the modern world. And in some ways, this is absolutely obvious once you put it into plain light. If you look into it, it is obvious that if we construct a world long before we even encounter it, what will we construct? Well, we are assuming that the world, firstly, doesn't really exist. It's a construct of our own. And you can also interpret that tendency when people say the world is out there, that means you can construct whatever you want. And you just give it credit of being out there. That is a sort of a nobility title, like being a count or duke or an earl. You say it's real. So you give it the sign of reality. Just because you know so well in your heart nothing you say has any value, it doesn't feel real, and you just make the whole thing up. Well, this is of course, and I will get into that more later, inauthentic living. And this is looking for the thinginess in the things and not letting the things be what they are, to present themselves, to be like gold. And this is something Richard Capobianco mentions. It's a text that never was translated, written somewhere in between the year of my birth, 66 or 68, and it mentions Pindar, and he calls existence for gold, aurum in Latin. And this gold has this nice, fantastic, glimmering, lustrous quality, and this quality makes for happiness and enjoyment. It comes to the fore. It soothes you. It quenches your thirst. It is true richness. And I would say this is the original Sein, the Sein of the Greek, when it still shined, when it was not disregarded and turned into a subjective thinginess. And this golden flavor of the world, or golden sight of the world, or golden touch of the world, was never ever at this stage distance from us. Did you hear all those adjectives? Those are adjectives that are pointing to connection, to your sensory makeup, that you really can understand them. And this is what Pindar meant with gold, according to Heidegger. True gold. And true gold makes itself heard. and need not to be occupied, taken, put in a box, made it into something less. It can come to fore in its all shininess and glory as it is, if we let it. The goal is gone, says Heidegger. It's a malaise of the modern time. And that malaise is everything is now thinginess, even thinking itself. Our actions and our deeds, we become cold inside, and we do no longer partake. And it could actually be that the word reality, it's just a fancy denomination that we give to some currency, like the penge. Like, you can look it up. The penge apparently was a fancy name given to the currency in Hungary, but it was a lie. It sounded like money, but it was more funny. It has the most rocket-like inflation that any currency ever had. It was up to the billions in the end. And I'd say this is what we've done with the word or the idea of reality. It has become something of a penge, a currency that lost its value. And we're too eager to categorize our real living perceptions around us. Look at this tree with red leaves. How often do people take these in? I think it's a blood oak. But those things become ignored, taken for granted, not cared about, because something is already in place, and that something that is already in place tells you, it's the same thing. It is just surface. It doesn't have any depth. It doesn't have a beauty. We stop talking about beauty, and we stop perceiving beauty, I would say, as well. We use other words. We say that the painting speaks, or that it has force. It is powerful. This is the language of this lesser take, when we don't have access and we are absolutely starving for knowledge. And trust me, I've been feeling that for years on end. Same things that I already had put in new packages, renamed and presented by a teacher, professor with a stale attitude, not interested in reality, and I'd say deceitful. No one ever should be allowed to rob you of your reality. And isn't it odd? If you speak to a physicist today, he would say, yeah, the world comes into being and it's constantly new, and it's not based on what previously was only. But everyone else, they will go into the chorus of the stale, well-established patterns, grids, locks, closings, all those things that makes the world lesser, and they will sing in a unison chorus, reality. When you only have representation, you will not reach into truth. Truth will be something that is locked from your sphere. You can't get into truth, because truth is the dynamic presence. The presence you get when you care for something, when you look at something with care, not hard eyes that don't see, non-caring eyes, like non-caring hands, if you get the drift, or a non-caring body and mind who doesn't care about what he understands and what he thinks. Then you can reach the Sein. Capobianco points to that over and over again in his book. It is always a possibility, and it's a possibility for everyone. It just needs to be preserved. And therefore, I think he is maybe a defender of the true and the original, the one that quenches the thirst for understanding and guides you in the right direction with care. When in this made-up world we have neither falsehood nor do we have truthhood, we become eerie. Our voices become hollow. Something that is so clearly shown in phonetics, that our real prosody is disappearing. The tremor, the intonation, the pitch, the glory of our voices are disappearing. They become flatter, they become less. And I think it is this deslocalization we get when we turn everything upside down. How can you be localized when you think space is limited? Space is eternal. It does not disappear, and the amount of space is enormous. So why do the absolute majority of people think that there is a limitation in space? Limit their own range so that they don't even lift their chests when they breathe. A constricted breathing, a breathing that does not help understanding, because that constrictedness is of the mind. That is the angst, the anxiety, the fear. The fear that everything is just a charade, unreal, a theater. That is the lowest of moods you can get into. And that is when you look for the thinginess of the things and the Sein of the Seiendens, instead of seeing Seiendens as something coming from Sein, being. You could also call that a state of starvation. Knowledge starvation, maybe. This with mood is absolutely all important to understand what mood is. This is something I've been working with. It's quite hard, because I think most authors, they write mood as a sort of a quality, that there are different qualities to the mood, that there is something in the middle, some sort of existence, and then you put a mood to that. For instance, I see a house, and the mood I'm presently in is happy, sad, joyous, surprised. So you have both the house and then you have the emotion, something like that. That is not mood. And I would say that absolute majority of interpreters of Heidegger say that is mood. That is bringing in subjectivity once more. The mood is never ever separated from anything. You don't have the whole world. You don't have Sein und Seiendens and mood. It does not work like that. And it was not intended by Heidegger that way. And such an understanding, I think, will block out further understanding. You will be standing where you are. You need to get through that. And he did explain it. Yes, Sein und Zeit is a very complicated book, no doubt. And I would not even recommend anyone to start reading it. And it's harder to read these days than it were when it first came out. No, it's better to ease our way, but take it carefully. Do it piano piano, as Toto Betunio sang when he had his famous hit in the 70s, Sono Italiano. But it's a good advice, piano. If we rush these things, if we have this narrow focus in the understanding, this grasping, and this is something I recently learned in trying to learn, I wouldn't say a whole language, but at least some of a new language. And I've been trying hard to make the words sit in my head, and I've also been trying to understand them, sort of have them in my head so they will turn up whenever I want them to do that. And all of a sudden the other day, thanks to a lot this understanding of mood, I realized I've been forcing the understanding and made that understanding subjective. And that means an understanding that has much less energy, and that does not open up either to remembrance or understanding. And when I eased that up, understanding came to me. So I think it's a double fold, as I usually say, between the world, the presence in you meet, and your own being, and that they are not that different as you think. And all of a sudden the structures were let to come into place by themselves. I didn't force the structures on them. I didn't force different grammatical things, different inflections, past tense, and so forth. It was allowed to come to the fore by itself. It was invited, and the difference was huge. And yes, I read that loads of time. I think I heard about it the first time 20 years ago, but it wasn't until now I really understood it, because it sounds so unlikely that to be the case. How can learning come easier when you don't struggle? Well, I needed an understanding of mood. Without that understanding, it wouldn't have been possible. Mood is not an exclusion. It's not on top of the rest of presentation. It is in there, in with the whole thing. And then I realize I can sort of push my understanding a little bit, but then I need to let it come into me. And it got so much easier both to remember and to learn. And it was a physical relief, because you should always demand that. All knowledge, whether it's erkenntnis or bevisstheit, is a liberation of the body. It's here that sits. If you don't open up, if you tense yourself, understanding won't come. Of course, knowledge shows us in the direction of harmony. Otherwise, what would be the use? Or put it differently, how could it be separated? Whoever came up with that? Was it René Descartes in his miserable state? I don't think so. It's a gift with double takes. It's a bit of a pharmacon. Could be medicine, could be poison, but today it turned out mostly into poisonous, festering about, making knowledge so very hard to get. And when we don't get it, when it becomes opaque, when it doesn't open up to us, we get aggressive and we rename. We give it another feature, and that feature won't feed us. It's just a blank copy of the thing we want to have, and that simply will not be enough. It will not feed into the process, and you will not get a new knowingness of the external nor the internal. And of course, in this process, as I mentioned before, we have that common trend among scholars and others, that they lose both the whole and the particular. They become blunt, dull. They can be neither specific nor general. They cannot go into detail, neither can they go into universals. They can't have the global take, because that threatens the little integrity they have left. But at the same time, you can't go into the distinct details, because the tensions that are built up in the body makes you want to grasp. And it's a little bit like putting into a thread into the eye of a needle. If you try too hard, it won't do. You will start to shake, and the thread will never come into the eye of the needle. I think all of us, I think that's easy to relate to. You all must have one experience where you've been trying too hard and it simply will not open up to you. I had that experience with language now. I realized it was such a relief, and it was a literal relief, because this is not separated from the knowingness. It is the intellect, and if it's in balance, the intellect is working. If it's not in balance, there is no intellect there at all. Then you only have this subjective self-construct, that are rules by rules that are not sane, not functioning, and the rules are constantly made up after the fact. So we do something arbitrarily, and then we say, it was a rule to cover that. I give it some logic, I give it a nice costume, and that is like putting the cart to the horse. And it's inhumane. When you make yourself inhumane, unheimlich, not at home in yourself or with others, you become hard. And this hardening is exactly what will not let knowingness come to the fore. Understanding will not come when the hardness is there. I would like to do a comparison here, especially the incredibly interesting Geometric Genesis from Nick Huggett, Laws for Nowhere, have some saying here. I would like to compare Living in the Matrix, the movie series that apparently is going to have a fourth one, I don't know when, and modern day artificial living. I think it's rather obvious when you see the movie, the inspiration is modern day. The feeling of having no control, and that the world is unreal. And that I would say that the great success of the movie was not caused by Keanu Reeves. I would not say he is a grand actor, but the idea is just marvelous. And I remember when I saw it the first time. Afterwards, we all said, "Ah, we can relate to that. We understand it." Oh, shit. Sorry for the bad vocabulary. I think it came about as soon as I mentioned soon as Keanu Reeves came up, the winds got angry. Maybe it has something to do with his name. I think Keanu means wind or wave in Hawaiian. I don't remember. Would have been funny if it meant wind. I think that movie and that series of movies, the trilogy, really spoke to us. We could relate to that. And the mechanistic inside of this world, the oiliness, the coldness, the lack of humanity, the lack of care, the lack of compassion, those machines seem to lack everything human. This is exactly the modern world, and that was written in many reviews as well. But that was also the genuine feel from us who went to see it. This is how it is. And of course, that makes a grand model to compare with. Imagine that we are a bit like that, hooked up to machines, and the reality is just sort of fed into us through the matrix. Machine-like programming our brains. It's a fairly good parallel, I would say. But it does have its problems. One of them being that without the body we can't feel at all. And those bodies are not engaged. A body is an absolute necessity. But it's still a fairly good parallel if we point on some other things. I would say one of those things is freedom. Heidegger constantly talk about freedom, and when we get unseynlich, when we are not directed to design, we're not open to design, we get this modernism. That was his take on what happened in modern times. We are being inauthentic, and therefore there is no freedom. You can't make choice. And in the matrix you could actually do choices, even if those were limited to the computer world, they were still choices. But it's important to realize when Heidegger speaks of no choice, he means it even more fundamentally. You can't even make choice in your thinking. And this is, a lot of people from neurology will raise their hand and agree 100%. This is what we found, and this is what Ben Libet is pointing to as well. Lack of freedom even in the thinking. At least in the Matrix they had some sort of freedom in that artificial world. And if I remember the first movie right, there was somebody who wanted to stay there. I think it was that curly-haired fellow. And he was pointed to be an immoral person. Of course he was a traitor as well, but it was a sort of an act of immorality. I think we're worse off here, because there's no place, we can't go to a special place to control our own thinking, our own consciousness. Uh, and another thing, it is absolutely impossible to be cut off from the world. We still have a contact to it. We just simply ignore it ourselves. Or rather, when we cut off our bodies, which we do quite literally, we lose that intake. And that intake is our own thinking, because maybe the matrix is pointing to some idea that you can make a division between the world and thinking. And that is not really possible. You need to cut off both thinking and the world, or that is what we're doing. But disregarding these differences, we can continue the parallel and see if it is interesting. Number one, I would say, in the matrix no truth can exist. We shut our eyes, we shut our ears, and we shut our feeling, our kinesthesia, our proprioception, me holding this too tight, which I just felt here, standing on my toes, clutching my knees and so forth. This is what we do, artificially, so to speak, to cut ourselves from the body, because the body knows, and it's this knowingness that we shy away from, habitually, ideologically, knowing, like this is the knowing we have. This is why we shut the body out. This is most definitely a state of being unreal in a very fundamental way. Very fundamental way. The second take, we will end up in a reality that is not stable from time to time. It constantly fluxes, and it randomly goes there and then there. We don't have understanding. We are not together with the world. And if we're not together with the world, we cannot have stability. That might seem odd. One might think, if you cut off the world, you can have stability. No, that is not the case. Not the case, because space and time does simply not work that way. It's a fundamental misunderstanding, I would say. And we need to reach into the Seinsfrage to solve that. When we let in the body into the action, then we start a Sorge with the things, including our own body, caring for it, not putting it into torturous positions. Only then, when the body is harmonious and it's striving to get more harmonious, can we have truth. And then we can have freedom, because there is no freedom in a mind that is fluctuating ever so much and have no understanding from its own working, because the mind itself is working from time and space. And then you realize how fundamental this misunderstanding is. It's even so fundamental a misunderstanding, I would say, that name misunderstanding is not fit. It's more of a complete attitude in living, a different mood altogether. This is, of course, authoritarianism as well, because in this thingness, this lack of access to what makes us strong and healthy and balanced and upward and thinking, we need to obey others. And here Heidegger is absolutely excellent, because others wouldn't be a good word. Instead he has das Man, and that is more of a uniformity, not something to directly point into. And it could be one, it could be two. It doesn't have neither plural nor singularity. It is just das Man. And of course, in that skewed perception in the matrix, we don't have a clear understanding even what it could be. We just automatically bow to it, like a very scared dog running away even from a rat. I've seen that myself. So we don't know what das Man is. Might not even exist. But we bow down to it. This is authoritarianism at its worst. Our bodies, that's the third take, will be in angst or fear. I would say that wouldn't be so much the case in the Matrix, but it is to some extent. They shiver and so forth while they are hooked up. But here in the Heideggerian take of this Weltarm, world poor, it is more about when you don't have access, you get scared, you don't know where you are. It is exactly, and this is literal, coming from neurology, we are literally lost in darkness. And if you go around in darkness, assume that you are in the woods in the middle of the night and you don't see anything. There is no moon, there is no starlight. You get scared. It's a healthy reaction to an absurd situation. And in this state we will always tense, and that would be to a great degree. And there will be dissatisfaction for the whole system, not giving us any freedom to think, because thinking itself is just that, letting the Seiendens be, not manipulating them. That is Denken as thankful, not forcing the thoughts to come. Struggle, like making these things with your brows or wrinkle your forehead and so forth. That is not Danken, thankfulness. That is pure modernity. Fixating, tensing, rigid, rigidity. That is rigidity in body and rigidity in mind. It's the same thing. And that will be an inhumane and stale modus. And there will be a lack in quantity, because that quantity you can build up or you can waste it. And we're currently wasting it to a high degree. And that means that less and less understanding is possible. For getting understanding, you need to build up the quantity of the modus. These different states, and I end the comparison here, and I would like to make a little commentary from the view of Heidegger. These are beings that are inauthentic. They don't live their lives as they want, not according to their needs, nor their wishes. Heidegger himself, as I indicated earlier, would not say that we follow the will of others, but one maybe could say that we follow what we think is the will of others, no matter who they might be. And because we can't even understand those people either. This is inauthentic understanding, because here it can, as I said, be no true understanding. And this is what I failed to pronounce earlier, Seinsverlassenheit, when you leave being at the side. You don't let it come in, do its thing, so to speak. Reminds me of something I heard Louis Armstrong said once. Somebody asked him, how do you make those notes play or get together? Well, if you don't know, you will never know, he said. And that shows that you will not have to ask the question if you don't have this Sein, so to speak. And of course, this is the modern malaise of boredom, melancholy, lack of gratuity thinking. This Denken and Danken. Danken, which is thankfulness or thanking. It will be an unthankful business, unrewarding, because the rewards are in das Sein, in the word, so to speak. Here we have this unfree state, and we are continuing forcing ourselves in this ungrateful business, like a donkey being whipped against its will, going in some horrid landscape where there's not even any water. And that whipping is the thinking of today. It's not that nice, lucid, clear thinking. It's a forced thinking. So in a way, it's an unfreedom both within and without. And doesn't seem to be any cure. Although in the movie The Matrix they can get out of their positions. That would have been easy. That would be nice. Just take a pill, take the blue pill, and you're out. I don't know. Here, there is no cure, there is no pharmacon. The change from the lack of freedom, or unfreedom, if you can invent a word like that, sounds Shakespearean. I would say inauthentic is the more suitable, because it shows exactly what it's about. You're no longer an authentic person. Gadamer, he would have wanted another word. He would call it authoritarian in a strictly ordinate and hierarchical way. And that is someone who always tries to conform to rules, whose purpose, which purpose, he cannot understand, and he will also try to enforce rules and obligations to others. Rules and obligations that he himself lacks understanding of. Otherwise, he would be a good ruler and not authoritarian. So it's not a ruling in itself. It is that the authoritarian person doesn't understand rules or what he's trying to enforce. Merleau-Ponty, for instance, he calls this the forgetfulness of the body, intellect, and the sensing capacity, and the desensitizing of mind. I really like that. We no longer feel our own thoughts. They come automatically or forced, which is more or less the same thing. And we have no chance of informing them or telling them or speaking to them or listening to them. So we become cut off, unfriendly with the world. we no longer listen to the voice of the friend, because we can't even understand him. Understanding has become scarce. It does no longer come to us. Merleau-Ponty had a nice word there. He calls that Empressism. That is his take on Empressism. And that is the doctrine that all knowledge comes from sense experience, that we passively register what is out there. And when something is said to be out there, don't trust that. I think that is a way of heightening our own, or giving a nicer demeanor to our own thinking. And we say it's out there to sound presumptuous. Those thoughts don't reach anywhere, I would say. Not to us clear out there. And here's also another word that relates a lot to this thing, and Merleau-Ponty called that the body subject, and that transcends the separations of body and spirit and points to how at the bodily level of existence there is a meaning-giving thing. Constitution takes place at the level of the embodied pre-reflective level of relating and experiencing. In our everyday experience, our bodies is not an object among others, but it is our orientation to the world, or in the world, I would say too. That goes to show how important the body is, because without the body we can't localize, we can have no direction in our thinking. The cutting off of the body, the constructing, as Richard E. Lynn called the reflective consciousness, is the cutting off of the intellect and the body. All of it goes. And then you have a sort of non-understanding emerging. And that non-understanding we often refer to as consciousness. Something that is not permanent, it's constantly fluctuating, and it's rather stressful, to be honest. It's not that nice thing it used to be, I can imagine. It doesn't have the flavor of freshness, understanding, or depth. No, it's rather shallow, and it's aggressive because it decides what the world is. Also, it decides what other people say. So it's not listening to the voice of anyone anymore. So when you are there, you will not listen anymore. Listening goes out to the window. We are not in a listening state. We tell the world what it should be. And then we neither project our energy. Projecting means also to balancing up. If you're not balanced when you go into text, the understanding would be different. It would be very different indeed. So all understanding is at the outset bodily. That's the pre-reflective mode, because the body is 98% of all the thinking that goes on. And if it's not governed or directed by a consciousness or an awareness that wants to go in a certain direction, the body will have problem going in a sound and healthy direction. It will not do it to the same extent anyway. It can be healed, and I think now more than ever, when so many parts of science have given up the old stale model, it's even a better chance. And oddly enough, those who say they should react to science, they stop reacting when this subject comes up. When the gory details of quantum mechanics comes up, that sort of points to that they are not situated in the world. Then very often people get turned off or locked down. They go into the robotic state. I would say there's no need for that. Being active, participating in the world, this is where we have all the good stuff. This is where all the glory is. This is all where all artworks or a musical, all of literature, all of understanding, all of intellect, all of partaking. And it's also where morality, because it's a moral attitude as well. Saying that you don't care about the world is saying you don't care about others. It ends up in the same thing. And there is, in this Empressism, as Merleau-Ponty calls it, it's a lack of compassion. It's the idea that if I take away compassion, my understanding will be sharper. It is just the opposite. And this I mentioned already from Damasio, and maybe 1.5 years ago already. If you don't sort of interact with others, your intellect is the first thing to disappear, because then your body won't be recognized. It cannot be like an engine working on fumes. It needs its nutritions, and that nutrition is other people. Their smiling faces, their liveliness, that sort of places you into reality once more and make you into a human being. Nothing wrong with being a human being. And no, it looks promising. I will see if I can look some more into this. So this was Geometry Genesis by Nick Hatchett, I think it was. Let's check here. Nick Huggett and Richard Capobianco. Capobianco must be White Cape, I think. Like a half island sticking out somewhere. Easier to remember that way. I think I have reason to get back to these fellows. 5 fingers out of 5 fingers for these people. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.